Tim Ball has been, well, banned, censored, threatened. He has been called pretty much every name you can imagine. Racist, fascist, Nazi, and so on. I prefer to call him Doctor, and I admire him as an expert on alleged climate change. Dr. Ball, welcome to the arena.
Thank you, Michael.
I mean, it's true, isn't it? I mean, I know when I had you on my last show, you were banned from speaking at a high school. People referred to you as being almost Hitlerian. You seem a very gentle soul to me.
Well, I try to be a gentle soul, but as you were talking about in your programs, the truth is a very dangerous thing to try to uphold.
Now, unlike most people who work in television, I am not an expert in the history and application of physical science. Sorry to admit that, but, you know, I've got a few degrees, but they're in the arts and literature and so on. Which is odd, because every other person, especially on the left, on TV, in radio, and writing in newspapers, they're all experts in this. So, I want you to explain to me, sir, climate change, the world's all going to end, Al Gore is a saint, David Suzuki, polar bears dancing, all this sort of thing. Is it true? Is climate change an issue? Global warming, tell us the truth. Over to you.
No, first of all, they started with global warming because they wanted to focus on CO2, and they accused people like me being, being a skeptic about global warming. The world has warmed up, but it depends on what period of time you take. I point out that the world's warmed up since 1680. That's not the issue. The issue is what's the cause. And then when they realized that the global temperature was going down since 2000, even though CO2 continued to rise, they moved the goalposts, and this is one of the things that's a giveaway. And they started talking about climate change. Well, of course, climate change, talking about climate change is akin to saying women have babies. Climate changes all the time. It's a very natural thing. But the problem is most people don't know or understand the extent to which climate changes naturally. So they're able to argue that the climate is changing as if it has never done that before. And then when you point out, no, look at how warm it was or how cold it was 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago, then they say, oh, it's more rapid. The change is more rapid now than before. And that's simply not true either. So, of course, to raise the ante, instead of being a global warming skeptic, which was acceptable because all scientists are skeptics and should be, they started calling us climate change deniers with all of the Holocaust connotations of that term. So the truth is the climate is changing. It's always changed. It's not changing outside of natural variability, but they want to try and prove that the climate change is being caused by humans because they want to use that as part of a political agenda.
So man-made global warming is an oxymoron. I mean, it's an inherent contradiction. There may be some climate change, but it has nothing to do with what men and women do.
That's right. And of course, what they've done is they set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to try and prove that there was evidence that humans were causing warming initially, and now that they're causing climate change. But in doing that, they narrowed the focus. And this illustrates how the game has been played, Michael, because they defined climate change as only those changes caused by human activity. They didn't look at natural variability. And you can't possibly identify whether there's any human effect or impact at all if you don't know how much it's changing naturally and what the mechanisms are. So, for example, they virtually ignore the sun as a factor of climate change. Yet, I mean, everybody knows that the sun is the main source of energy, and it's only got a flicker, and it has an effect on us.
But here's the issue here. Hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars now have gone into educating, indoctrinating children at school, grown-ups in the theatre and cinema, TV, radio, dramas and documentaries, telling us this is the great challenge to the world. We can all come together as people of different races and genders and religions to stop climate change. It's the major issue now. What you're saying is, it's a lie.
It is a lie, and it's a total waste of money and a total waste of people's lives. People are suffering. The biofuels one is a good example where it's pushed corn prices through the roof when it's a completely unnecessary thing. And here's the irony of it is you produce more CO2 when you burn biofuels than when you burn fossil fuels. But the idea was, of course, that the money has been spent through government agencies. When Morris Strong set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he deliberately did it through the World Meteorological Organizations, which meant that every single weather agency in every country in the world was involved.
Okay, Tim, let me stop you there, Tim. Tim, I want more time on this when we come back to do this properly, unlike most TV stations. So stay with us, but with more of this. You'll be with us, I know you will, in a few moments' time. Welcome back to the arena. Tim Bull, we were chatting with before the break, and I mentioned that he's a man who's been banned and threatened and censored and, I mean, just personally abused and insulted because he dares to, as a scientist, refute these, I suppose, well, wild accusations, and that's what they are, about man-made climate change. Tim, before the break, you mentioned that this is very political. I think this has to be emphasized. This is not pure science. This is acutely political, isn't it?
Well, and of course, the point that you made about millions of people and sciences and dollars is proof of that. And they made the argument that there's a consensus of scientists. Well, consensus is not a scientific fact. It only works in politics. And of course, that's why they've made that argument. But to pick up on the theme of the World Meteorological Organization and national agencies, all of the funding through Environment Canada, for example, on climate change research has only gone to those scientists that have tried to prove the hypothesis that human CO2 is causing an increase in the atmosphere, which is causing an increase in temperature. That's completely against the way science is supposed to operate. What happens in science is that a hypothesis is produced, and then other scientists, as skeptics, as we talked about earlier, then try to disprove it. You don't try to prove a hypothesis, you try to disprove it. If it's withstands the disproof, then it becomes a theory and a standard law eventually. And so what they've done is they've controlled the funding to only one side of the scientific approach, and that's how they've been able to control it. Just to give you an example, the Auditor General of Canada showed that Environment Canada spent $6.8 billion in 7 years on climate change, but all of it went to proving the hypothesis to those people that were willing to say what the government were arguing was happening. So it's been totally controlled, directed. And by the way, what's interesting is most scientific funding goes through an arm's length from government agency. Climate research funding went through Environment Canada. That's how they kept control of it.
I know for a fact, as you do, people have lost their jobs, many people. They've been threatened, sometimes physically. I'm not sure if the public understand just how severe this is. It is extraordinary. I was incredulous when I first heard about this. This is beyond dispute. The question I have to ask you is why? Why are people being treated thus, and why are people who are obsessed with climate change being so oppressive and intolerant of others?
Well, of course, I think that there's a couple of things with it. The reason that they chose climate change and particularly global warming as a vehicle for a political agenda was it goes back to actually to Malthus, the argument that the world's population is exploding and it will outgrow the food supply. Yeah. Well, of course, that's turned out to be incorrect. That got picked up by the Club of Rome in 1970s, and they extended that into there are too many people in the world, and they're using up the world's resources in total too much. And of course, they particularly blamed those industrial nations that were using up these resources. And so they wanted to show that the industrial nations were at the root of the problem and that we needed to reduce their abilities to use up these resources. So Morris Strong made the statement to Elaine Dewar in a book that she published called Cloak of Green, where she was in fact trying to show what great people these people were, and then she found out the opposite. But he said to her that the problem for the planet are the industrialized nations, and isn't it our responsibility to get rid of them? And of course, how do you shut down industrialized nations? You turn off the fuel supply, the fossil fuels, or you show that the byproduct of those fossil fuels is destroying the world climate. And so that's why they set up the IPCC the way they did. And by the way, when Elaine Dewar said to Strong, okay, that's a great political agenda, why don't you run for politics? His comment was, you can't do anything as a politician. I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money and not be accountable to anybody. And that's precisely what he did. And so the climate then became a vehicle for a political agenda. Now that's coupled with, Michael, the abuse of environmentalism. Environmentalism was a new paradigm that came in, very necessary. All of us are environmentalists, although a few, and you've already talked to other people in other subjects about the extremists, a few grabbed this up and claimed they're the only ones that care about the planet and the environment, which is an absolute outrage. But environmentalism was part of this shift to focus on climate and humans' impact on it. And of course, environmentalism has effectively become a religion. So if you combine politics and religion, and that's why the U.S. founding fathers try to separate church and state, then you see the problems that evolve from it. So this is the unholy alliances that have evolved.
Okay, a lot more to discuss, but Tim, Dr. Ball, I have to say, I know what you've been through. I admire you. I think you're a very brave man. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity, Michael.